Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What happens when an empire that has ruled a vast land for nearly 2 centuries suddenly prepares to leave, and the question of who will inherit that land has no simple answer? In the summer of 1947, the Indian subcontinent stood at a quiet but uncertain threshold. For generations, millions of people across cities, villages, mountains, and fertile plains had lived under British rule. Now that rule was coming to an end. Independence was approaching quickly, and many people felt a sense of excitement that had been building for decades. Yet beneath that excitement was another feeling, an uncertainty about how such a large and diverse country could reorganize itself once the imperial structure disappeared. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, share your location and the local time where you're listening tonight. It is always fascinating to see how far these quiet journeys through history travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the weeks before independence, officials in British India worked late into the evening in offices across New Delhi. Maps lay spread across long tables. Files and reports moved quickly between administrators, soldiers, and political leaders. The British Empire had ruled much of the Indian subcontinent for nearly 200 years, but now the final decision had already been made. Britain would withdraw. For many people living in India, the news of independence carried deep meaning. Generations had lived under colonial rule, and movements demanding self-government had grown steadily throughout the early 20th century. Political leaders had organised protests, negotiations, and campaigns calling for the right of Indians to determine their own future. Yet the question that now faced the subcontinent was not simply whether India would become independent. That had already been decided. The deeper question was what shape that independence would take. British India was not a single, simple country. It was a vast region stretching from the mountains of the north to the tropical coastlines of the south, and from the deserts of the west to the river deltas of the east. Within this enormous landscape lived hundreds of millions of people belonging to different religions, languages, traditions, and historical communities. For centuries, many of these communities had lived side by side. In towns and villages across the subcontinent, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, and other communities often shared marketplaces, schools, farms, and neighbourhoods. Their customs were different, and their histories were complex, but daily life often unfolded with a quiet sense of coexistence. During the final years of British rule, however, political debates about the future of the region began to sharpen. Leaders representing different communities offered competing ideas about how independence should be organised. Some believed the subcontinent should remain united as one country. Others believed that separate states might better protect religious or cultural communities. These discussions unfolded in legislative halls, private meetings, and large public gatherings. Newspapers carried speeches and political arguments to readers across the country. For many ordinary people, the debates felt distant at first, something discussed mainly by politicians and lawyers in major cities. But as independence approached, the decisions made in those discussions began to take on immediate consequences. At the centre of these events were several major figures whose political influence shaped the direction of history. Among them were Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leaders who each held strong views about how the future of the subcontinent should unfold. Gandhi had become internationally known for promoting non-violent resistance against colonial rule. His approach emphasized peaceful protest, civil disobedience, and moral persuasion. Over many years, his leadership helped inspire large movements demanding greater autonomy for Indians. Jawaharlal Nehru, another central figure in the independence movement, believed strongly in building a modern, democratic nation after British rule ended. He spoke often about unity across religious and cultural lines, and imagined an India that could represent all of its people within a single political framework. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the All India Muslim League, had come to believe that Muslims of the subcontinent required their own sovereign state. His argument developed gradually over the years, especially as political negotiations between different parties became more difficult. By the mid-1940s, these debates had become central to the future of the region. The British government, already weakened by the economic and political strains of the Second World War, recognised that maintaining colonial rule over India was no longer sustainable. The war had dramatically changed global politics. Britain had emerged victorious, but the cost had been immense. Resources were strained, and public opinion within Britain increasingly supported withdrawing from colonies, where maintaining control required enormous administrative and military effort. India itself had played a major role in the war effort. Millions of Indian soldiers had served in the British Indian Army, fighting in regions ranging from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Their participation highlighted the growing political expectation that Indians should soon govern their own country. By 1946, negotiations between British authorities and Indian political leaders had intensified. Several proposals attempted to outline possible arrangements for independence, including ideas that would keep the country united under a federal system while allowing significant regional autonomy. But agreement proved difficult. Political mistrust had grown over time, and fears about the future of different religious communities began to influence negotiations. Some leaders worried that minority groups might face discrimination within a single centralized state. Others believed dividing the country would create new problems that would be even harder to manage. While these discussions continued at the highest levels of politics, daily life across the subcontinent moved forward as it always had. Farmers prepared crops for the coming seasons. Merchants opened their shops in crowded bazaars. Families arranged marriages, celebrated festivals, and gathered for evening meals. In cities such as Lahore, Delhi, and Calcutta, people from different communities still lived in the same neighbourhoods. Many had known one another for years, sometimes generations. The idea that political decisions might eventually require large populations to move across newly drawn borders had not yet fully entered public imagination. But the pace of political change was accelerating. In February 1947, the British government announced that it would transfer power to Indian leadership no later than June 1948. This announcement signalled that the end of colonial rule was now only a matter of time. Soon afterward, a new viceroy arrived in India to oversee the transition. His name was Lord Louis Mountbatten. As the final representative of British authority in India, Mountbatten carried the responsibility of guiding the region through its last months under imperial administration. Mountbatten quickly began meeting with major political leaders, listening to their concerns and evaluating possible solutions. He understood that the decisions made in the coming months would shape the future of hundreds of millions of people. During these meetings, one possibility increasingly moved to the centre of discussion: the partition of British India into two independent states. The idea of partition had been debated for several years, particularly by leaders of the Muslim League who argued that Muslims required a separate homeland where they would form the political majority. The proposed state would later be called Pakistan. At the same time, leaders within the Indian National Congress continued to express hope that independence might still produce a single unified country. Yet by 1947, the political divisions had grown increasingly difficult to reconcile. Mountbatten eventually concluded that partition might be the only practical path toward a peaceful transfer of power. The proposal involved dividing British India into two separate dominions, India and Pakistan. This decision would require drawing entirely new borders across regions where communities had long been interwoven. The most complicated cases involved provinces where religious populations were mixed, particularly Punjab in the northwest and Bengal in the east. These regions would soon become the centre of one of the largest migrations in human history. In offices and meeting rooms across the subcontinent, officials began quietly preparing for a future that very few people yet fully understood. Maps were studied, census records examined, and administrative plans drafted. At the same time, rumours began spreading through towns and villages. People heard that new borders might soon divide the country. Some wondered whether their homes would fall on one side of the line or the other. At first, many assumed that whatever changes occurred would remain largely administrative. Few imagined the enormous human movement that would soon begin, yet the stage had already been set. The end of empire was approaching quickly, and the decisions made during those months would soon send millions of people onto roads, railways, and migration routes across the subcontinent. The story of that migration, the largest mass movement of people in modern history, would begin only weeks after the celebrations of independence. For now, however, the subcontinent remained in a moment of uneasy anticipation, waiting for the final shape of the new borders that would soon transform the lives of millions. During the 18th century, the Indian subcontinent was already a place of great political change. The Mughal Empire, which had once governed much of the region, was gradually weakening. Its authority had stretched across enormous territories for centuries, but by the early 1700s, local rulers and regional powers were becoming more independent. Provinces that had once answered to imperial officials in Delhi began to operate with increasing autonomy, and rival kingdoms competed for influence. Into this shifting political landscape arrived a different kind of power. The British East India Company had first come to the subcontinent as a commercial enterprise. Founded in 1600, the company's purpose was trade. Its representatives established coastal trading posts where goods such as textiles, spices and tea could be purchased and shipped to markets in Europe. At first, these trading stations were small enclaves that relied on the permission of local rulers. Company merchants negotiated with Indian authorities, paid customs duties, and operated within the commercial networks that already existed across the region. Indian textiles, particularly fine cotton and silk, were highly prized in European markets, and trade grew steadily during the 17th and early 18th centuries. But the East India Company gradually developed ambitions that extended beyond commerce. Company officials realized that controlling territory could secure trade routes and protect their economic interests. To achieve that control, the company built private armies composed of European officers and Indian soldiers known as sepoys. These forces allowed the company to participate directly in regional conflicts. When disputes arose between local rulers, company officials sometimes offered military assistance in exchange for political or financial concessions. Over time, these alliances placed the company in a position of increasing influence. One of the most important turning points came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. In this confrontation, company forces under Robert Clive defeated the army of the Nawab of Bengal. The victory was achieved through a mixture of military action and political manoeuvring, including agreements with local figures who withdrew their support from the Nawab during the battle. The outcome of Plassey gave the East India Company effective control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in the subcontinent. From that moment forward, the company was no longer simply a trading organization. It had become a governing authority, responsible for administering large territories and collecting taxes from millions of people. During the following decades, the company expanded its reach across other parts of India. Through wars, alliances, and treaties, its territories grew steadily. British officials developed administrative systems to manage land revenue, maintain order, and regulate trade. Courts, bureaucracies, and military garrisons became familiar parts of the landscape. For many local communities, these changes were gradual but noticeable. Traditional systems of authority were reshaped as company administrators introduced new methods of taxation and governance. Land revenue policies often required farmers to pay fixed amounts regardless of seasonal conditions, which sometimes created hardship during poor harvests. At the same time, the British presence also introduced new infrastructure and institutions. Roads and ports were expanded to facilitate trade. Missionary schools and colonial colleges were established in major cities. English gradually became an important language within administrative and educational circles. These developments created a complex relationship between British rulers and the populations they governed. Some Indian elites found opportunities within the new system. Educated Indians entered professions such as law, civil administration, and journalism. Others became critical of colonial policies and began to question the legitimacy of foreign rule. During the 19th century, tensions between colonial authority and local populations occasionally erupted into conflict. The most dramatic example occurred in 1857, in what became known as the Indian Rebellion or the Sepoy Mutiny. The uprising began among soldiers in the British Indian Army. Several factors contributed to their dissatisfaction, including concerns about military conditions and cultural insensitivity by British officers. A particular controversy involved new rifle cartridges rumoured to be greased with animal fat, which offended both Hindu and Muslim religious practices. What began as a military protest soon expanded into a wider rebellion. Soldiers and local leaders in several regions rose against British authority. Cities such as Delhi, Kanpur and Lucknow became centres of fighting as rebels attempted to restore older forms of governance. The rebellion lasted more than a year and involved intense battles across northern India. Eventually, British forces regained control, but the conflict had profound consequences. The British government concluded that allowing a private company to administer such a large territory was no longer acceptable. In 1858, the British Crown formally took direct control of India. The East India Company was dissolved, and the region became known as the British Raj. A new administrative system placed authority under a viceroy, representing the British monarch. Under the Raj, colonial governance became more structured and centralised. British officials expanded railways, telegraph lines, and irrigation systems across the subcontinent. Railroads in particular transformed transportation. They connected distant regions, allowed goods to move more efficiently, and made travel faster for both officials and ordinary people. Major cities such as Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras grew into large administrative and commercial centres. Universities were founded, newspapers circulated widely, and a new class of educated professionals emerged within Indian society. Yet the expansion of infrastructure and administration did not remove the underlying imbalance of power between colonial rulers and the local population. Decisions about governance ultimately rested with British authorities in India and policymakers in London. Economic policies also shaped everyday life. Many colonial strategies emphasised exporting raw materials such as cotton, tea and jute to global markets. While these industries generated wealth, they also altered traditional agricultural patterns in some regions. Periods of drought sometimes led to severe famine, particularly during the late 19th century. Scholars continue to debate how colonial policies influenced the scale of these crises, but it is clear that millions of people suffered during these difficult years. As the 20th century approached, political awareness among Indians continued to grow. Educated leaders increasingly argued that the subcontinent should be governed by its own people rather than by distant authorities across the sea. In 1885, a group of professionals and intellectuals established the Indian National Congress. At first, the organisation focused on discussing reforms within the colonial system. Its members petitioned British authorities for greater representation in government and expanded civil rights. Early Congress leaders believed that gradual change through negotiation might lead to a more balanced political arrangement. They held annual meetings where delegates from different regions gathered to discuss issues affecting the country. Meanwhile, other groups also began organising around political concerns. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded in the city of Dhaka. Its leaders sought to represent the interests of Muslim communities within the evolving political landscape of British India. At this stage, both organisations still operated within the framework of colonial administration. Their demands focused mainly on increased participation in government rather than full independence. However, events in the early 20th century would gradually shift these conversations toward more ambitious goals. The First World War had a significant impact on India. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in various theatres of the war under British command. Their participation demonstrated the importance of India within the broader empire, and many political leaders expected that loyalty during wartime would lead to meaningful political reforms afterward. Yet the reforms introduced after the war did not fully satisfy those expectations. While some administrative responsibilities were transferred to Indian officials, ultimate authority remained firmly in British hands. At the same time, the global climate was changing. Ideas about self-determination and national independence were gaining attention around the world. In many colonies, people began to question why distant empires should continue governing regions with long histories and rich cultural traditions. Within India, new voices emerged who believed the struggle for independence required broader participation from ordinary citizens. Among them was a lawyer who would soon become one of the most influential figures in the history of the independence movement. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi's approach to political action differed from earlier strategies focused mainly on petitions and negotiations. Drawing from ethical traditions as well as personal experience, he promoted non-violent resistance as a powerful tool for social change. Over time, his ideas would inspire millions of people across the subcontinent. The foundations of the independence movement were now firmly in place. Political organizations had formed, public debates about self-government had intensified, and colonial authority was increasingly challenged by new forms of protest. All of these developments unfolded across the same vast landscape, where communities of many different faiths and cultures continued to live together. For generations, the subcontinent had been shaped by the meeting of different traditions, languages, and identities, understanding that diversity would become essential in the years ahead, when the future of the region would be debated with growing urgency. Across the Indian subcontinent, daily life unfolded within a remarkable variety of landscapes and traditions. From the snow-fed rivers of the Himalayas to the warm coastal plains along the Indian Ocean, communities had developed distinct languages, foods, customs, and systems of belief over many centuries. The region was not a single cultural unit, but a vast mosaic of societies that had interacted with one another through trade, migration, and shared history. This diversity was visible in almost every aspect of ordinary life. In the northern plains, towns often grew around rivers that supported agriculture and trade. Wheat and rice fields stretched across fertile land, and farmers organized their work according to seasonal cycles that had remained familiar for generations. In the western deserts, settlements adapted to drier conditions, relying on hardy crops and careful water management. Along the eastern delta of Bengal, waterways shaped transportation, commerce, and village life. Languages changed gradually from one region to another. Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Punjabi, Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, Gujarati, and dozens of others formed part of everyday conversation across the subcontinent. Some languages were spoken by tens of millions of people, while others belonged to smaller communities with their own long literary traditions. Religious life was equally varied. Hindu traditions were practiced by a large portion of the population, but Hinduism itself contained a wide range of philosophies, rituals, and local customs. Islam had been present in the region for centuries as well, introduced through trade, migration, and earlier Muslim dynasties. Sikhism had emerged in Punjab during the 15th century, combining elements of devotional spirituality with its own distinctive teachings. Christianity, Buddhism, Jainism, and several other traditions also existed across different regions. Despite these differences, everyday interactions between communities were often routine and familiar. In markets and workshops, merchants and artisans worked side by side. In agricultural villages, families of different faiths sometimes lived in neighbouring houses, sharing wells, irrigation systems, and common spaces. Festivals marked important moments throughout the year. Some were religious celebrations, while others were seasonal gatherings connected to harvests or local traditions. In many places, people attended one another's celebrations even when they belonged to different religious communities. The rhythms of village life encouraged cooperation and practical relationships. Urban centres provided another layer of cultural exchange. Cities such as Lahore, Delhi, Calcutta, and Bombay had long served as meeting points for travellers, traders, scholars, and administrators. Their streets reflected a mixture of architectural styles, markets filled with goods from distant regions, and neighbourhoods where multiple languages could be heard within a single afternoon. Education also evolved within this diverse environment. Traditional systems of learning existed alongside newer institutions established during the colonial period. Religious schools taught sacred texts and philosophical traditions, while universities founded in the 19th century introduced modern academic subjects such as science, law, and political theory. Students who attended these institutions often encountered ideas from many parts of the world. European political philosophy, economic theory, and scientific research became part of the curriculum in colonial universities. At the same time, scholars continued studying classical Indian literature, mathematics, and historical traditions. This mixture of intellectual influences helped shape a new generation of political thinkers. Many leaders of the independence movement were educated in these institutions, where they encountered both Western political concepts and their own cultural heritage. As these leaders debated the future of India, they faced the challenge of representing a society that contained immense diversity. Creating a political system that could accommodate different religious communities and regional identities was a complicated task. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British administrators had already begun categorizing the population according to religious and communal identities through census records and electoral policies. Separate voting arrangements were sometimes introduced to ensure that certain communities had representation in legislative councils. While these policies were often presented as protective measures for minority groups, they also reinforced the idea that religious communities formed distinct political blocs. Over time, this classification influenced how people thought about representation and power within the colonial system. Political organizations began responding to these realities in different ways. The Indian National Congress generally emphasized the idea of a shared national identity that could include all communities. Its leaders spoke about unity and collective self-government. The Muslim League, while also participating in negotiations for political reforms, increasingly focused on protecting the political rights of Muslims within a future independent system. Many of its leaders worried that a democratic structure based on simple majority rule might place Muslim communities at a disadvantage in regions where they were not the largest population. These concerns did not appear suddenly. They developed gradually as political discussions expanded and electoral systems evolved. In provinces where populations were mixed, questions about representation, language, and cultural rights became more prominent. Yet even as political debates grew more complex, daily life across the subcontinent often continued in familiar ways. Farmers prepared fields, craftsmen shaped tools and textiles, teachers guided students through lessons, and traders transported goods along long-established routes. Railways, introduced during the 19th century, had connected many distant regions. A journey that once required weeks by caravan could now be completed in a matter of days. Trains carried passengers, agricultural products, industrial goods, and letters between cities and villages. These connections allowed people to move more easily for work, education, or family visits. Markets expanded, and urban centres became more accessible to rural populations. The railway system also meant that ideas and political news could spread quickly across wide distances. Newspapers played a particularly important role. Publications in English and various regional languages carried reports of political meetings, speeches, and debates about constitutional reform. Readers across the country followed discussions about representation, independence, and the future of the subcontinent. The early decades of the 20th century were therefore marked by both continuity and change. Traditional social structures remained important, but political awareness was growing rapidly. Organizations advocating self-rule attracted increasing support, especially after several key events highlighted the limits of colonial governance. One such event occurred in 1919 inches, the city of Amritsar, where British troops opened fire on a large public gathering in what became known as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The incident shocked the country and intensified demands for greater political autonomy. For many Indians, the event demonstrated how deeply unequal the colonial relationship had become. calls for reform soon evolved into broader demands for full independence. At the same time, discussions about the rights and concerns of different communities continued. Leaders within the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress sometimes cooperated, but disagreements remained about how future governance should be structured. These debates took place against the background of an enormously complex society. The subcontinent's diversity was both a source of cultural richness and a challenge for political organisation. Finding a system that could accommodate different identities while maintaining stability required careful negotiation. By the 1930s and early 1940s, those negotiations were becoming increasingly urgent. The pressures of global conflict and domestic political movements were reshaping the colonial administration. Britain's capacity to maintain control over such a large territory was gradually weakening. As the end of imperial rule approached, the question of how to organise the subcontinent's many communities became central to discussions about independence. The choices made during those years would eventually determine not only the political boundaries of new nations, but also the movement of millions of people whose homes, languages, and traditions were rooted in particular regions of the land. Understanding the diversity of the subcontinent helps explain why those choices carried such enormous consequences. The region was not simply a territory on a map, it was a living network of communities connected by history, memory, and daily life. By the early decades of the 20th century, the political atmosphere of British India had begun to change in noticeable ways. What had once been small gatherings of educated elites discussing reform within the colonial system gradually expanded into a wider movement that drew support from students, professionals, labourers, and rural communities. The idea that the subcontinent should eventually govern itself had moved from quiet discussion into a much larger public conversation. The Indian National Congress played a central role in this transformation. Founded in 1885, the organisation originally functioned as a forum where Indian leaders could present petitions and proposals to the colonial government. Early Congress members often believed that cooperation with British authorities might gradually lead to meaningful reforms. During its first decades, the organisation was dominated by lawyers, scholars, and civil servants who had received formal education under the colonial system. Their meetings were structured and procedural, with delegates representing different provinces gathering once a year to debate political questions. However, the limitations of this cautious approach became increasingly clear. Many reforms introduced by British authorities provided only modest changes in representation, while ultimate power remained firmly in imperial hands. This slow pace of reform created frustration among younger activists who believed stronger action was necessary. By the early 20th century, Congress itself began evolving. Leaders started encouraging broader participation from ordinary citizens, rather than limiting the movement to small groups of political professionals. Public rallies, newspapers, and regional organisations helped spread the message that political independence should become a national goal. At the same time, other political organisations were shaping the landscape of debate. The All India Muslim League, established in 1906, initially worked within the colonial framework as well. Its founders hoped to ensure that Muslim communities would have a meaningful voice in future political arrangements. Many Muslim leaders feared that democratic institutions based solely on majority voting might disadvantage communities that were numerically smaller in certain regions. Their objective was not necessarily separation at first, but rather guarantees that political systems would protect minority representation. Throughout the early 20th century, there were moments when Congress and the Muslim League cooperated. Leaders from both organisations sometimes joined efforts to advocate constitutional reforms. One example occurred in 1916 with the Lucknow Pact, an agreement that attempted to balance representation between communities while strengthening demands for greater self-government. The agreement reflected a brief period when cooperation seemed possible. Yet political circumstances continued evolving, and disagreements gradually returned as negotiations over representation and authority grew more complex. While these debates unfolded in legislative halls and public meetings, Another important change was taking place in how politics reached ordinary people. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches carried political ideas beyond elite circles. Railways allowed organisers to travel between distant provinces, and political gatherings attracted increasingly large crowds. Students played an especially active role in spreading nationalist ideas. Universities had become centres of intellectual debate, where young men and women discussed philosophy, history, and political theory. Many graduates returned to their home regions with new perspectives about governance and citizenship. This growing political awareness did not appear suddenly. It developed through years of discussion about identity, representation, and the future structure of society after colonial rule ended. The First World War had also influenced these developments. India had contributed enormous resources and manpower to Britain's war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, and many believed that such loyalty would be recognised with substantial political reforms. After the war ended, however, many of those expectations were disappointed. Although Britain introduced some administrative changes, full self-government remained distant. For activists within the independence movement, this reinforced the belief that stronger forms of pressure would be required. During this period, new leaders began emerging, who could connect political goals with the everyday concerns of ordinary people. Among them was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, whose approach to political action would reshape the independence movement. Gandhi had spent many years working in South Africa before returning to India in 1915. His experiences there had influenced his ideas about civil rights and non-violent resistance. Rather than relying only on political negotiation, he believed large groups of ordinary citizens could apply moral pressure through peaceful protest. His campaigns emphasized principles such as non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and self-discipline. Instead of violence or armed rebellion, Gandhi encouraged people to withdraw their participation from colonial institutions. Refusing to buy imported goods, boycotting certain taxes, and organizing peaceful demonstrations became tools of protest. These strategies resonated with many communities because they allowed participation without requiring weapons or formal political positions. Farmers, students, workers, and merchants could take part in actions that symbolized a collective demand for change. The movement soon spread across the subcontinent. Demonstrations occurred in cities and rural regions alike. Volunteers organized marches, meetings, and campaigns encouraging people to support local industries rather than imported British products. One well-known example was the Salt March of 1930. British law required Indians to purchase salt from government sources and prohibited them from producing it independently. Gandhi organized a long march to the Arabian Sea, where he symbolically produced salt in defiance of colonial regulations. The event drew international attention and demonstrated how non-violent protest could highlight the contradictions of imperial authority. Similar campaigns continued throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. While these movements emphasized unity, political concerns among different communities remained an ongoing part of discussion. The Muslim League continued advocating protections for Muslim political representation, and its leadership gradually began exploring the idea of a separate Muslim homeland. Muhammad Ali Jinnah emerged as the most prominent voice within the League. A trained lawyer known for his careful arguments and disciplined political style, Jinnah had once been associated with the Indian National Congress as well. Over time, however, he became convinced that Muslim interests might not be adequately protected within a single centralized state. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, this perspective gained greater attention. In 1940, the Muslim League formally proposed the creation of independent states in regions where Muslims formed a majority population. This proposal would later become known as the Lahore Resolution. The concept of Pakistan began appearing more frequently in political discussions. At this stage, the precise boundaries and structure of such a state remained uncertain, but the idea had entered the public conversation. Meanwhile, Congress leaders continued promoting a vision of independence based on a unified nation. Figures such as Jawaharlal Nehru argued that India's strength lay in its diversity and that a single democratic state could represent all communities. Negotiations between these competing visions became increasingly complicated. British authorities attempted to propose constitutional plans that might balance these concerns, but each proposal faced criticism from different sides. World events soon added further pressure to these already difficult discussions. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 once again placed India at the centre of global conflict. Without consulting Indian political leaders, the British government declared that India would participate in the war. This decision intensified frustration among nationalist groups, who argued that a country asked to contribute soldiers and resources should also be allowed to determine its own political future. Political tensions continued rising during the war years. In 1942, the Congress Party launched the Quit India movement, demanding immediate independence. British authorities responded by arresting many of the movement's leaders and imposing strict controls on political activity. Although the movement was suppressed in the short term, the message had been delivered clearly. Colonial rule was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. By the time the war ended in 1945, the political situation had changed dramatically. Britain faced severe economic challenges and growing pressure to reorganize its empire. At the same time, Indian political organizations were stronger and more organized than ever before. Gandhi and the politics of resistance. During the decades when political debate about India's future was becoming increasingly visible, one figure gradually emerged whose influence extended far beyond formal political institutions. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was not the founder of the independence movement, nor was he its only leader. Yet his approach reshaped how millions of people participated in politics. Gandhi's life before returning to India had already shaped many of his ideas. Born in 1869 inches, the coastal town of Porbandar in western India, he grew up in a household connected to local administration. His father served as a chief minister in regional courts, and Gandhi received an education that eventually took him to London to study law. After completing his legal training, he travelled to South Africa to work as a lawyer for Indian merchants. It was there, in the closing years of the 19th century, that Gandhi encountered racial discrimination directed at Indian communities living under colonial rule. These experiences became important turning points in his thinking. Instead of accepting discrimination quietly or responding with violence, Gandhi began experimenting with organized forms of peaceful protest. He developed a philosophy that emphasized moral resistance, self-discipline, and collective action carried out without physical force. The term he later used for this approach was satyagraha, often translated as holding firmly to truth. In practice, it meant refusing to cooperate with unjust systems while maintaining a commitment to non-violence. Over the course of 2 decades in South Africa, Gandhi organized campaigns opposing discriminatory laws that targeted Indian residents. These movements involved marches, boycotts, and civil disobedience. Participants accepted the possibility of arrest while maintaining peaceful conduct. When Gandhi returned to India in 1915, he entered a country where political activism already existed but had not yet reached the scale he envisioned. The Indian National Congress was active, but much of its leadership remained centred among educated elites. Gandhi believed political action could reach far deeper into society. He began travelling across the subcontinent, visiting villages, towns and cities in order to understand the everyday conditions faced by ordinary people. These journeys helped him connect the independence movement with practical concerns affecting farmers, labourers and small merchants. Rather than focusing only on constitutional reforms, Gandhi emphasized issues such as taxation, agricultural hardship, and economic dependence on imported goods. One of his early campaigns involved farmers in the Champaran district of Bihar. Local cultivators had been required to grow indigo for European planters under difficult conditions. Gandhi helped organize a peaceful protest that eventually persuaded colonial authorities to reconsider the system. This episode demonstrated how non-violent resistance could address both local grievances and broader political principles. Gandhi's reputation grew as someone capable of linking moral arguments with organised action. Over time, his influence within the Indian National Congress increased. He encouraged the organisation to transform itself into a mass movement, rather than a small assembly of political representatives. Membership expanded dramatically as new volunteers joined from many regions of the country. Campaigns organised during the 1920s and 1930s drew attention not only within India, but around the world. Newspapers in Europe and the United States reported on demonstrations that involved thousands of participants, yet remained largely peaceful. The Salt March of 1930 became one of the most widely recognised examples. British law required Indians to purchase salt produced under government monopoly, even though salt could easily be collected from coastal areas. Gandhi announced that he would walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the Arabian Sea, a journey of more than 200 miles. As he travelled, people from surrounding villages joined the procession. By the time the march reached the coast, it had become a national event followed closely by journalists and political observers. Upon reaching the shore, Gandhi symbolically picked up natural salt in defiance of colonial regulations. The gesture itself was simple, yet its meaning was clear. It demonstrated how ordinary people could challenge laws they believed unjust. Soon, similar acts of civil disobedience appeared across the country. Volunteers produced salt, refused certain taxes, and organised peaceful gatherings calling for independence. British authorities responded with arrests, including Gandhi himself, but the movement continued spreading. For many participants, these campaigns provided their first direct involvement in political activity. Farmers who had rarely travelled beyond nearby markets now joined demonstrations that connected their local concerns with the national question of self-government. Yet Gandhi's vision of independence extended beyond the removal of British authority. He also spoke frequently about the importance of harmony between religious communities. The diversity of the subcontinent was something he believed should be preserved rather than divided. In speeches and writings, Gandhi often emphasized that Hindus and Muslims had lived side by side for centuries. He hoped that a future independent India could continue that tradition of coexistence. However, the political environment during the 1930s and 1940s was becoming more complicated. The Muslim League, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, increasingly argued that Muslim communities required stronger political safeguards. Jinnah himself had once supported cooperation between Congress and the Muslim League. Early in his career, he had even been known as an advocate of Hindu-Muslim unity. Over time, however, he became convinced that the political structure proposed by Congress might leave Muslims without sufficient influence in a unified government. These concerns intensified during provincial elections held under the Government of India Act of 1935. Congress won control in several provinces, forming ministries that governed large populations. Although these administrations included members of different communities, Muslim League leaders felt their organisation had not been given adequate recognition. The experience deepened the sense of political separation between the two groups. Jinnah began presenting the Muslim League as the primary representative of Muslim political interests across the subcontinent. Meanwhile, Gandhi continued advocating unity and cooperation. His personal style of leadership emphasized patience, negotiation, and moral persuasion rather than strict political calculation. He frequently withdrew from formal political positions in order to focus on broader social issues. Campaigns promoting village industries, education, and communal harmony remained central to his vision for the country. The outbreak of the Second World War complicated these efforts. Britain's decision to involve India in the war without consulting Indian leaders caused significant political tension. Congress demanded a clear promise of independence after the war, while British authorities prioritised maintaining stability during the global conflict. In 1942, the Quit India movement emerged as a major turning point. Congress leaders called for the immediate end of British rule, arguing that continued colonial governance was no longer acceptable. The movement triggered widespread demonstrations. In response, the colonial government arrested many leaders of Congress, including Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. For several years, the independence movement continued largely without its most visible figures. By the time the war ended in 1945, political circumstances had changed significantly. Britain faced serious economic challenges and growing pressure to restructure its empire. Within India, the independence movement had matured into a national force that could no longer be ignored. Congress leaders were released from prison, and negotiations about the transfer of power resumed. Yet the question that now stood at the centre of those negotiations was no longer simply independence. Another possibility had gained strength during the war years, the idea that the subcontinent might be divided into separate states. This concept, associated increasingly with the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan, would soon reshape the political future of South Asia. The decades of resistance that Gandhi had helped lead had brought India closer to independence than ever before. But the form that independence would take remained uncertain, and the next stage of history would unfold through negotiations that carried consequences for millions of people across the subcontinent. In the years when the independence movement was gathering strength across the subcontinent, another political vision was gradually taking shape within the leadership of the All India Muslim League. At the centre of that vision stood Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a lawyer whose career had long been connected to constitutional politics and careful negotiation. Jinnah's early life followed a path that seemed typical of many political figures of his generation. Born in Karachi in 1876, he received an education that eventually brought him to London, where he studied law and developed a strong interest in parliamentary systems and legal institutions. When he returned to India, he quickly gained recognition as a skilled barrister and became involved in political discussions about constitutional reform under British rule. During the first decades of the 20th century, Jinnah was widely respected across different political circles. He participated in both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, and for a time he was known for encouraging cooperation between the two organisations. His reputation as a careful negotiator and advocate for constitutional solutions earned him considerable influence. At this stage in his career, Jinnah believed that the interests of India's many communities could be balanced within a shared political system. He supported agreements that attempted to provide representation for religious minorities while still maintaining a united structure for future self-government. One example of this approach was the Lucknow Pact of 1916, when Congress and the Muslim League reached an understanding about electoral representation. The agreement demonstrated that compromise between political groups was possible, and it was welcomed by many who hoped the independence movement could proceed with cooperation among communities. Yet political conditions did not remain stable. During the 1920s and 1930s, disagreements about representation, provincial authority, and constitutional structure gradually intensified. Electoral reforms introduced by the British government created provincial legislatures where political parties competed for influence. These elections revealed how differently various regions of the subcontinent were organised socially and politically. In some provinces, Muslims formed large majorities, while in others they were smaller minorities living alongside Hindu, Sikh, and other communities. For leaders of the Muslim League, this uneven distribution raised concerns about what a future democratic government might look like. If the entire subcontinent operated under a single central authority elected by population, Muslim political leaders worried that their communities might not have enough influence in decisions affecting national policy. Jinnah became increasingly focused on these questions. His speeches during the 1930s reflected a growing belief that constitutional safeguards might not be sufficient to guarantee political balance. Instead, he began exploring the possibility that Muslim-majority regions should have greater autonomy. These ideas took clearer form in March 1940 at a large political gathering in Lahore. During this meeting, the Muslim League adopted a resolution proposing that areas with significant Muslim populations in the northwest and eastern parts of India should be organised into independent states. The document did not yet provide precise borders or administrative details, but its meaning was clear enough. It suggested that Muslims constituted a distinct political community that might require its own sovereign homeland. Over time, this proposal became widely known as the demand for Pakistan. The word itself combined elements of regional names Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan, and also carried a meaning in Urdu and Persian, suggesting purity or a land set apart. Supporters of the proposal believed such a state could protect the political rights and cultural traditions of Muslim communities. Not everyone within the subcontinent agreed with this idea. Leaders of the Indian National Congress continued advocating for a united India that would include citizens of every religion. They argued that centuries of shared history and cultural exchange made division unnecessary. Jawaharlal Nehru, one of Congress's most prominent leaders, often spoke about the possibility of building a modern democratic nation that respected the diversity of its population. In his view, political identity should be based on citizenship rather than religious affiliation. Gandhi shared similar hopes. Throughout his public life, he emphasized cooperation between religious communities and warned that political separation might create long-term difficulties. Yet the political atmosphere of the early 1940s made compromise increasingly difficult. The Second World War had altered global power structures, and Britain's capacity to maintain colonial authority was weakening. At the same time, the war created urgency within Indian politics. British leaders needed the support of Indian resources and soldiers, but Indian political parties wanted clear commitments about independence after the war. Negotiations attempted during these years often ended without agreement. Each proposal faced criticism from one side or another, reflecting how deeply the political landscape had changed. By the mid-1940s, the Muslim League had gained significant support in many Muslim-majority regions. Provincial elections held in 1946 demonstrated this shift clearly. The League won a large number of seats reserved for Muslim voters, strengthening Jinnah's position as the principal spokesman for Muslim political interests. For Jinnah, the results confirmed his argument that Muslim communities across the subcontinent increasingly identified with the League's vision. He now approached negotiations with British officials and Congress leaders from a position of greater authority. Meanwhile, tensions between communities sometimes surfaced in local conflicts, particularly in provinces where populations were closely mixed. Political demonstrations occasionally turned into confrontations that revealed how fragile relations could become under the pressure of uncertainty. In August 1946, violence in the city of Calcutta shocked the entire subcontinent. Large demonstrations connected to political disputes escalated into widespread unrest that lasted several days. News of the event spread quickly, increasing concern about the possibility of further conflict. Political leaders on all sides recognized that the situation was becoming more difficult to manage. The British government, facing economic strain after the war and growing international pressure to decolonize, began considering faster plans for withdrawing from India. Within this environment, the demand for Pakistan moved from theoretical discussion into a central issue of negotiation. Jinnah insisted that Muslim-majority regions must be allowed to form their own independent state if Muslim communities were to feel secure in the future political order. Congress leaders still hoped that some form of federal arrangement might keep the subcontinent united while granting significant autonomy to provinces. Yet the gap between these visions was becoming increasingly wide. British officials found themselves attempting to mediate between positions that were growing more difficult to reconcile. Each side believed its proposal represented the most stable path forward. As the final years of colonial rule approached, the possibility that India might be divided into separate states became more widely discussed across the country. For many ordinary people, however, the idea still seemed distant. Farmers continued planting crops, traders opened their shops each morning, and families arranged their daily routines without knowing how political decisions made in distant capitals might soon reshape their lives. War, weakness, and British withdrawal. The closing years of the Second World War created conditions that made the future of British rule in India increasingly uncertain. For decades, the British Empire had relied on a mixture of military power, administrative systems, and political alliances to govern the subcontinent. Yet by the mid-1940s, The foundations of that system had begun to weaken. The war itself had placed enormous demands on Britain. Fighting across Europe, Africa, and Asia required vast financial and military resources. Maintaining those commitments strained the British economy and left the country facing significant debt by the time the conflict ended in 1945. Even before the war concluded, British policymakers had begun discussing how the empire might need to change. India had played a major role in the war effort. Millions of Indian soldiers served in the British Indian Army, fighting in campaigns that stretched from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Indian industries also contributed supplies, equipment, and agricultural products needed for wartime logistics. The scale of this participation reinforced the importance of India within the imperial system. At the same time, it strengthened the expectation among many Indians that their country should soon determine its own political future. During the war years, the independence movement had not disappeared, even though many of its leaders had been imprisoned after the Quit India movement of 1942. Political discussion continued quietly in many regions, and organizations maintained networks that could mobilize public opinion when circumstances allowed. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, Britain faced the challenge of rebuilding its economy while also managing colonial territories that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. The newly elected Labour government in Britain was more open to decolonisation than earlier administrations had been. Within India, political leaders who had been imprisoned during the war were gradually released. Negotiations about the transfer of power resumed with new urgency. The British government first attempted to explore constitutional arrangements that might preserve a united India while allowing different regions a degree of autonomy. One such proposal came in 1946 through a delegation known as the Cabinet Mission. Its members arrived from Britain with the goal of negotiating a political structure acceptable to both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. The Cabinet Mission plan proposed a federal arrangement in which India would remain a single country but would be divided into several large groups of provinces. These provincial groups would have significant authority over their internal affairs, while a central government would manage defence, foreign policy, and communications. For a brief period, the proposal appeared promising. Both Congress and the Muslim League initially accepted parts of the plan, though their interpretations of how it should function were not identical. Congress leaders viewed the plan as a step toward a unified independent state with democratic institutions. They believed the grouping of provinces might eventually fade as political cooperation developed. The Muslim League, on the other hand, saw the provincial groupings as a pathway toward greater autonomy for Muslim-majority regions. From their perspective, the structure could eventually lead to the formation of Pakistan if those regions chose to separate later. These different expectations soon created tension. As discussions continued, disagreements emerged about the powers of the central government and the authority of provincial groups. Political statements made by leaders on both sides were interpreted as signs that the agreement might not hold. By the summer of 1946, cooperation between Congress and the Muslim League had broken down. The Muslim League withdrew its earlier acceptance of the Cabinet Mission plan and announced plans for political demonstrations to show support for its demand for Pakistan. In August of that year, large political rallies took place in several cities. In Calcutta, demonstrations connected to these events escalated into violence that lasted several days. The unrest deeply unsettled many communities and illustrated how fragile the political environment had become. Reports of the violence travelled quickly through newspapers and word of mouth. For many observers, it raised concerns that further conflict could spread if political negotiations failed to produce a clear solution. Meanwhile, British authorities were reassessing their timetable for leaving India. Earlier plans had suggested a gradual transition that might take several years. But as tensions increased and Britain's domestic challenges grew more pressing, officials began considering a much faster withdrawal. In February 1947, the British government made a decisive announcement. It declared that power would be transferred to Indian leadership no later than June 1948. This statement set a clear deadline for the end of colonial rule. To oversee the final stages of the transition, Britain appointed a new viceroy. Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in India in March 1947, with instructions to negotiate a settlement that would allow Britain to leave while avoiding widespread instability. Mountbatten quickly began meeting with major political leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and representatives from other parties. His task was complicated by the fact that each leader held firm views about the structure of independence. Congress still hoped to maintain a united India if possible, though its leaders also recognized that political realities were changing rapidly. The Muslim League remained committed to establishing Pakistan as a separate state. Mountbatten soon concluded that achieving a unified solution might no longer be realistic. The level of mistrust between political organizations had grown too great, and the possibility of widespread unrest was becoming a serious concern. As discussions continued through the spring of 1947, the idea of partition moved steadily from possibility to plan. British officials began examining how the subcontinent might be divided into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan. This proposal required drawing entirely new international borders through regions where communities had lived side by side for generations. The provinces of Punjab in the northwest and Bengal in the east would be particularly affected, as their populations included large numbers of both Hindus and Muslims. Mountbatten's administration began studying census records and administrative maps in order to understand how these divisions might work. Yet time was limited. The deadline for British withdrawal was approaching quickly. The political leaders negotiating independence understood that decisions made within these few months would shape the future of hundreds of millions of people. Still, the practical details of how borders might affect everyday life remained unclear to most of the population. In towns and villages across the subcontinent, ordinary routines continued. Farmers prepared fields for planting, markets filled with traders and customers. Children attended school as they always had. Few people yet realized that the political decisions unfolding in government offices were about to transform their world. The weakening of British authority, combined with unresolved political divisions, had set the stage for a dramatic transition. Independence was now certain, but the form it would take was still being determined, drawing a line across a continent. By the spring of 1947, the final months of British rule in India had become a period of urgent decision-making. Negotiations between political leaders continued in New Delhi, while British officials tried to determine how authority could be transferred without leaving the region in administrative confusion. The deadline announced by the British government meant that time was limited, and every discussion carried consequences that would shape the future of the subcontinent. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had arrived as the last Viceroy of British India, understood that the situation required swift action. His task was not only to end colonial rule but also to oversee the creation of new governments that could function independently. Achieving that goal required agreement between the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, and the British administration. During his meetings with leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Mountbatten found that the political gap between their positions remained wide. Congress leaders still preferred a united India, but they also recognized that continuing disagreement might lead to prolonged instability. The Muslim League maintained its position that Muslim-majority regions should form a separate state. Mountbatten concluded that partition might be the most practical solution, even though it involved enormous complexity. Dividing British India into two new dominions, India and Pakistan, would require the creation of entirely new international borders. Those borders would pass through provinces where communities of different religions had lived together for generations. Two regions became central to the problem: Punjab in the northwest and Bengal in the east. Both provinces were large, economically important, and religiously mixed. Neither could easily be assigned entirely to one state or the other. Punjab contained substantial populations of Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. The region was known for its agricultural productivity and its extensive canal systems that supported farming across wide plains. Cities such as Lahore and Amritsar were important cultural and commercial centres where different communities had long lived side by side. Bengal presented a different but equally complicated picture. The eastern part of the province had a Muslim majority, while western areas contained more Hindu communities. Calcutta, the largest city in the region, served as a major port and industrial centre. Deciding how to divide these provinces required careful examination of demographic data, administrative boundaries, and transportation networks. Yet the schedule for independence left very little time for such detailed analysis. To lead the process, British authorities appointed a lawyer named Sir Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe had never visited India before receiving this assignment. His reputation as a legal expert was strong, but he had no previous experience with the subcontinent's geography, culture, or political landscape. When Radcliffe arrived in India in July 1947, he was given only a few weeks to complete the task of drawing the borders between India and Pakistan. The scale of the responsibility was enormous. His decisions would affect tens of millions of people and determine which villages, cities and rivers would fall on either side of the new international boundary. Radcliffe chaired 2 boundary commissions, one for Punjab and one for Bengal. Each commission included representatives from the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. Their role was to present arguments about which areas should belong to each future state. Meetings of the commissions were formal and technical. Lawyers and officials examined census statistics, maps, and administrative records. They discussed factors such as population distribution, transportation routes, and economic resources. However, the representatives often disagreed strongly about how these factors should be interpreted. Each side hoped to secure regions that were culturally important or strategically valuable. Radcliffe listened to these arguments, while also reviewing large collections of documents prepared by colonial administrators. Despite the detailed information available, the task remained extremely difficult. Religious populations were rarely separated by clear geographic lines. Instead, communities often lived interwoven across towns and villages. As the deadline for independence approached, Radcliffe worked long hours examining maps and drafting proposals. The boundaries he created would later become known as the Radcliffe Line. Meanwhile, preparations for independence continued elsewhere. Government departments were divided between the 2 future states. Military units were reorganized, and plans were made to transfer administrative authority. The speed of these changes created an atmosphere of uncertainty throughout the country. Rumours circulated about which districts might become part of India or Pakistan, but the final boundary decisions were kept secret until independence had officially taken place. In many regions, people waited anxiously for confirmation of where the border would fall. Landowners wondered whether their farms would remain within the same country. Merchants questioned which trade networks would continue operating. Families considered how political divisions might affect communities that had long been connected through marriage, friendship, and shared work. The governments that would soon lead India and Pakistan also began preparing for the practical challenges of independence. New ministries were formed, civil servants were assigned to emerging administrations, and legal frameworks were drafted to guide the transition. For Jawaharlal Nehru and other Congress leaders, the coming independence represented the fulfillment of decades of political struggle. They hoped the new state of India would establish democratic institutions and begin building a modern nation. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, soon to become the leader of Pakistan, focused on organising the foundations of a new country that would represent Muslim political aspirations. His responsibilities included establishing administrative structures in regions that would soon become Pakistan's territory. While these preparations unfolded at the highest levels of government, ordinary life across the subcontinent remained uncertain. Many people still did not know exactly where the border would appear. Railway stations, markets, and city streets continued functioning as they always had. Yet conversations increasingly included questions about what independence might bring. Some believed that the transition would be mostly administrative, involving new governments but leaving everyday life largely unchanged. Few fully anticipated the scale of movement that would soon follow the announcement of the borders. The Radcliffe line was completed in mid-August 1947, only days before the official transfer of power. The maps were finalised quietly and delivered to British authorities for publication. Soon the world would witness the birth of two independent states. Celebrations would take place in cities across the subcontinent as colonial rule formally ended. At the same time, the lines drawn across maps in Radcliffe's office would begin to transform the lives of millions of people who suddenly found themselves living on one side of a new border or preparing to move across it. Independence and uncertainty. As August 1947 approached, the long process of ending British rule reached its final stage. Across the Indian subcontinent, preparations were underway for a historic moment that many generations had anticipated. The British Raj, which had governed the region for nearly 2 centuries, was about to come to an end. Two new nations would soon emerge, India and Pakistan. The official date for the transfer of power was set for mid-August. Pakistan would formally come into existence on August 14, followed by India on August 15. The timing reflected both administrative planning and political negotiation, and it marked the conclusion of months of intense discussion among British officials and Indian leaders. In Karachi, which would serve as the first capital of Pakistan, preparations began for the inauguration of a new government. Muhammad Ali Jinnah arrived in the city to assume his role as the leader of the newly formed state. He was sworn in as Governor-General of Pakistan, a position that symbolized both authority and responsibility during the country's earliest days. Jinnah addressed members of the new Constituent Assembly, outlining the challenges that lay ahead. The new government would need to establish institutions, maintain order, and provide services for millions of citizens spread across a large and diverse territory. At nearly the same time, ceremonies were being arranged in New Delhi to mark the birth of independent India. Jawaharlal Nehru, who had become one of the most prominent leaders of the independence movement, prepared to take office as the country's first Prime Minister. On the evening of August 14, Nehru addressed the Constituent Assembly of India in a speech that reflected the historic significance of the moment. He spoke about the long struggle for independence and the hopes that accompanied the arrival of self-government. Outside government halls, cities across the subcontinent prepared for celebrations. Flags representing the new nations were raised above public buildings. Crowds gathered in streets and open squares to witness the transition from colonial rule to independence. In Delhi, the midnight moment of independence on August 15 was marked by ceremonies that symbolized the beginning of a new chapter in the country's history. The British Union Jack was lowered, and the flag of independent India was raised in its place. For many people, the event carried deep emotional meaning. Decades of political activism, sacrifice, and negotiation had led to this moment. Families listened to radio broadcasts, joined public gatherings, or quietly reflected on the significance of the change. In Pakistan, similar feelings accompanied the first days of independence. Citizens welcomed the creation of a state that many believed would protect the political and cultural interests of Muslim communities. Yet alongside these celebrations, another reality was beginning to unfold across the subcontinent. The boundaries dividing the two new countries had been drawn but not yet widely announced. Many communities still did not know on which side of the border they would soon find themselves. The official publication of the Radcliffe Line occurred only days after independence ceremonies had taken place. When the maps became public, the decisions revealed how provinces such as Punjab and Bengal had been divided. In Punjab, the boundary cut through villages, farms, and transportation routes that had long connected communities across the region. Cities that once functioned within a single administrative system now belonged to different countries. Bengal experienced a similar division. The eastern portion of the province became part of Pakistan, forming what would later be known as East Pakistan. The western districts remained within India as the state of West Bengal. For people living in these regions, the announcement of the boundaries quickly transformed political discussion into immediate personal decisions. Families began considering whether they should remain in their homes or move to areas where their religious communities formed the majority. In many towns, the first responses involved uncertainty rather than immediate movement. Residents had lived together for generations, and leaving familiar surroundings was not an easy choice. At first, some believed that everyday life might continue despite the creation of new national borders. They hoped that communities could adapt to the new political arrangement without requiring major changes in population. However, reports of tension in certain areas began to spread through newspapers and word of mouth. In some regions, disputes between communities became more visible as people tried to understand how the new political boundaries might affect local authority and property ownership. Local administrators faced difficult tasks. Police forces, civil servants, and military units were in the process of being divided between India and Pakistan. Maintaining order during such a large transition required coordination that was not always easy to achieve. Railway networks also needed to be reorganized. Trains that once moved freely across the subcontinent now crossed an international boundary that had only recently been established. Border checkpoints had to be created, and new administrative procedures were introduced. Amid these changes, increasing numbers of families began preparing to move. Some left villages quietly, hoping to resettle with relatives in areas where they believed conditions might be more stable. Others travelled towards cities that seemed safer or more organised. The early stages of movement were relatively small compared with what would follow. Many people still hoped that relocation might be temporary or limited to a few individuals rather than entire communities. Yet as the days passed, it became clear that the division of the subcontinent would produce a much larger migration than anyone had initially predicted. The provinces most affected by partition contained tens of millions of people. Once movement began on a large scale, roads, railway lines, and rural paths would soon carry enormous numbers of travellers seeking new homes. The celebrations of independence had marked the birth of two nations. Now those nations faced the immediate challenge of responding to the movement of people across newly drawn borders. Within only a few weeks, the quiet decisions made by individual families would combine into one of the largest migrations in modern history, the first movements of millions. In the days following the announcements of independence and the publication of the Radcliffe Line, the political decisions made in distant offices began translating into visible changes across the countryside and cities of northern India and Pakistan. What had first seemed like a distant administrative adjustment gradually became something far more immediate. People who had lived in the same towns for generations began asking themselves whether their homes now lay in the country where they wished to remain. The provinces of Punjab and Bengal felt the earliest effects. Both regions contained large populations of different religious communities, living closely alongside one another. With the drawing of the border, many individuals believed that moving to areas where their own communities formed the majority might provide greater safety and stability. At first, these movements were cautious and relatively small. A few families would pack belongings and travel to nearby towns. Others went to stay temporarily with relatives in districts that appeared calmer. Some merchants relocated their businesses in order to remain connected to familiar trade networks. The decisions were rarely simple. Leaving a home meant more than just abandoning a building. It involved stepping away from farmland that had been cultivated by the same family for generations, shops built through years of work, and neighbourhoods filled with familiar faces. In many villages, conversations took place late into the evening as residents discussed what the new borders might mean. Elders weighed practical concerns, while younger members of families considered the opportunities or risks that might lie across the frontier. Some communities initially chose to remain where they were, believing that the political change would not greatly alter local relationships. They hoped that long-standing ties between neighbours would continue despite the creation of separate national governments. But the flow of information in those weeks was uneven and sometimes confusing. Newspapers reported incidents of unrest in certain regions, while rumours travelled through markets and railway stations describing events that were not always confirmed. Stories about attacks or forced departures created anxiety, even in places where daily life still appeared calm. Gradually, movement began increasing. Trains leaving major cities started carrying passengers who intended to resettle on the other side of the border. Railway platforms filled with families holding bundles of clothing, cooking utensils, and small valuables. Many travellers carried only what they could lift themselves. The railway system, which had once been designed primarily to support trade and administration across a unified colony, suddenly became one of the main pathways of migration. Long lines of carriages moved slowly across the plains, transporting thousands of people toward destinations that were still unfamiliar. Not everyone travelled by train. In rural regions where railway stations were far away, groups of families set out on foot or by cart. Ox-drawn wagons carried household goods along dusty roads. Some travellers moved in small groups, while others joined larger caravans that formed as different families chose the same direction of travel. In Punjab, the direction of migration often followed religious lines. Many Muslim families living in eastern districts began travelling west toward territories that would become part of Pakistan. At the same time, Hindu and Sikh families from western districts moved east toward Indian territory. These journeys did not always begin with a clear plan. Some travellers simply aimed for towns where they believed their communities would be present. Others hoped to reunite with relatives who had already moved. Local administrators attempted to monitor the situation, but the pace of movement soon made it difficult to keep precise records. Every day, more families joined the roads and railway lines. Cities became important gathering points during these early weeks. Lahore, Amritsar, Delhi, and other urban centres saw large numbers of newcomers arriving in search of transportation or temporary shelter. Schools, public buildings, and open grounds were sometimes used to accommodate travellers who had not yet reached their final destination. Markets adapted quickly to the changing situation. Merchants sold blankets, food, and simple tools needed for long journeys. Water carriers and food vendors appeared along busy roads, providing supplies for travellers moving across the countryside. Even as migration increased, many individuals still believed their journeys might be temporary. Some planned to return once political conditions stabilized. Others left belongings behind with neighbors in the hope that they might eventually come back to reclaim them. Yet the scale of the movement continued growing. Entire neighborhoods in certain towns began emptying within days. Houses were locked, fields were left unharvested, and shops closed their doors as families prepared to depart. Railway officials struggled to manage the sudden demand for transportation. Trains that once carried modest numbers of passengers now departed, packed with people standing in aisles or sitting on rooftops of carriages. Schedules became irregular as stations tried to organise the flow of travellers. Government authorities in both India and Pakistan recognised that the migration was becoming larger than originally expected. Plans were made to establish reception centres where newcomers could receive food, water, and medical assistance. At the same time, the new administrations were still organising their own bureaucracies. Ministries were being formed, civil servants were being reassigned, and communication systems were adapting to the presence of a new international boundary. This combination of rapid migration and administrative transition created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Many decisions had to be made quickly, often without complete information about how conditions were evolving in distant districts. Despite these challenges, countless journeys continued across the plains of northern India and Pakistan. Each group of travellers represented a family story. Parents guiding children along unfamiliar roads, elderly relatives riding in carts, young men carrying bundles of possessions gathered from homes they might never see again. The early movements of August and September 1947 marked only the beginning of what would soon become one of the largest migrations in recorded history. Trains, roads, and long caravans. As the weeks following independence unfolded, the movement of people across the newly created borders increased steadily. What had begun as small departures by individual families soon developed into large streams of migration that stretched across the northern plains of the subcontinent. Roads, railways, and rural tracks carried travellers moving in both directions between India and Pakistan. Punjab became the centre of the largest movement. The province had been divided almost evenly by the Radcliffe line, leaving millions of people suddenly located in a country where they were no longer part of the majority community. For many families, the decision to move was influenced by a mixture of uncertainty, rumours, and practical concerns about safety. Railway stations across Punjab became gathering places for travellers hoping to reach cities or districts where they believed conditions might be more stable. Platforms filled with families carrying bundles of clothing, bedding, cooking vessels and small personal items. Some passengers waited patiently for hours, while others arrived in large groups hoping to secure space on already crowded trains. The railway network that had once connected the entire region under a single colonial administration now functioned as a corridor between two separate states. Trains travelled from cities such as Lahore toward Amritsar and Delhi, while others moved in the opposite direction toward Pakistani territory. Inside the carriages, passengers shared limited space as best they could. Some sat on benches designed for far fewer people, while others stood in aisles or perched on the roofs of the trains. Families tried to remain together, keeping children close and watching carefully over their belongings. The journeys were often slow. Railway lines were busy with an unusual number of trains, and schedules were difficult to maintain. Stations along the route became temporary stopping points where travellers waited for water, food, or instructions about the next stage of their journey. Not everyone could travel by rail. In many rural districts, railway stations were distant, and transportation options were limited. For those communities, migration took place along roads that had long connected villages with regional markets. Caravans of bullock carts moved gradually along these routes. Farmers loaded carts with sacks of grain, wooden furniture, cooking utensils and bedding. Children sometimes rode beside their parents, while older family members walked alongside the animals guiding the carts forward. Some groups travelled on foot, carrying their belongings on their shoulders or balanced on wooden poles. The journeys could take several days or even weeks depending on distance and weather. Along the way, travellers rested beneath trees, near wells, or beside roadside shelters where water was available. The sight of long caravans moving across the plains became increasingly common. From a distance, they appeared as slow-moving lines of carts and walkers stretching along dusty roads that disappeared into the horizon. Local communities along these routes often responded in practical ways. Wells were opened to provide drinking water. Food vendors set up temporary stalls near busy intersections. In some places, residents organised small relief efforts for travellers passing through their districts. Cities also felt the growing pressure of migration. Delhi, for example, saw large numbers of refugees arriving from regions that had become part of Pakistan. Schools, parks and public buildings were adapted to provide temporary shelter for families who had not yet found permanent homes. Similar situations developed in cities on the Pakistani side of the border. Lahore received large numbers of Muslim migrants travelling from eastern Punjab and other regions that had become part of India. Local authorities attempted to organise housing and food supplies, but the rapid arrival of newcomers created significant logistical challenges. Administrators in both countries were still in the process of building their governments. Ministries responsible for health, transportation, and public welfare were only beginning to operate under the new national administrations. Responding to the sudden movement of millions required coordination that was difficult to achieve during such a rapid transition. Despite these challenges, migration continued expanding. Entire villages sometimes decided to relocate together, believing that travelling as a group might offer greater security and support. Leaders within these communities organised the order of travel, ensuring that children and elderly members received assistance along the route. Communication between migrating families also played an important role. Letters carried by travellers or railway workers informed relatives about conditions in distant towns. These messages helped guide decisions about where families might settle after crossing the border. Many migrants hoped to reach cities where relatives or members of their religious community already lived. Urban centres offered opportunities for employment and access to markets where families could begin rebuilding their livelihoods. At the same time, agricultural districts also received newcomers who planned to continue farming. Governments in both India and Pakistan began considering how abandoned farmland might be redistributed to families who had left property behind in other regions. The journeys themselves required patience and endurance. Travellers adjusted their routines to the conditions of the road. Early morning departures allowed groups to avoid the heat of midday. Evening stops provided time for cooking simple meals and resting before the next stage of travel. Children sometimes adapted more quickly than adults to the rhythms of migration. They explored roadside fields, gathered firewood, and helped with tasks such as fetching water. For many of them, the journey became an unfamiliar but memorable chapter of their lives. Meanwhile, political leaders in both new countries monitored the scale of migration with growing concern. Reports arriving from provincial officials indicated that the number of people crossing the border was increasing rapidly. What had once seemed like a manageable relocation of communities was evolving into one of the largest population movements in modern history. Violence across the Punjab. As migration across the new borders increased during the late summer and autumn of 1947, the province of Punjab became the most affected region of the partition. The province had been divided almost directly through its centre by the Radcliffe line, separating cities, villages, and agricultural lands that had once functioned as part of a single administrative system. Within a short period of time, millions of people began moving east toward India or west toward Pakistan. Punjab had long been known as one of the most fertile and economically productive areas of the subcontinent. Its extensive canal irrigation system supported large wheat and cotton harvests, and its towns were important centres of trade and craft production. The population of the region included large Muslim communities, as well as significant Hindu and Sikh populations. For generations, these groups had lived in towns and villages that often contained mixed neighbourhoods. When the new border appeared on maps in August 1947, the reality of partition arrived suddenly for many residents. Communities that had once shared markets, fields, and local institutions now found themselves separated by an international boundary. As migration began, uncertainty spread through districts that had previously been relatively stable. In some places, tensions between communities that had been present during earlier political disputes began to surface more openly. Local disagreements sometimes escalated into confrontations as families prepared to leave their homes and relocate across the border. Rumours about events in neighbouring districts travelled quickly, creating anxiety in towns that had not yet experienced conflict. During these weeks, reports began reaching government officials about violent incidents occurring along migration routes and within certain settlements. Groups of travellers moving across rural roads sometimes encountered attacks that forced them to abandon possessions or alter their routes. In towns where authority had weakened during the transition between governments, maintaining order proved difficult. Railway transportation, which had become one of the main methods for moving refugees, also faced serious challenges. Trains filled with migrants sometimes travelled through districts where tensions were high, and railway authorities struggled to ensure that journeys remained safe. The governments of both India and Pakistan recognised that conditions in Punjab required immediate attention. Military units and police forces were deployed to assist in protecting transportation routes and refugee movements. However, organising these efforts was complicated by the fact that the British Indian Army itself was being divided between the two new countries. The partition of the armed forces meant that officers and soldiers were in the process of being reassigned according to the nationality of the units they would serve. During this transition, command structures were still being reorganised, which limited the ability of authorities to respond quickly in every district. Despite these challenges, efforts were made to escort large groups of migrants across the border. Armed patrols sometimes accompanied caravans of refugees travelling along roads between Punjab's major cities. Railway trains carrying migrants were also occasionally provided with military protection. Even with these precautions, the scale of migration created conditions that were difficult to control. Entire districts were experiencing rapid population change as families departed in large numbers. Villages that had once contained mixed populations sometimes emptied almost entirely within days. Cities also felt the impact of these developments. Lahore, which had been one of the most important urban centres of Punjab, experienced significant population shifts as residents relocated. Hindu and Sikh families who had lived in the city for generations began moving toward Indian territory, while Muslim migrants from eastern districts arrived seeking new homes. Amritsar, located only a short distance from the new border, underwent similar changes in the opposite direction. Muslim families leaving Indian territory passed through the city as they travelled westward into Pakistan. In both countries, administrators faced the enormous task of providing assistance to refugees who had arrived with limited resources. Temporary camps were established near major cities where migrants could receive food, medical care, and shelter while searching for permanent homes. The experiences of refugees varied widely depending on where they travelled and how quickly authorities were able to organise assistance. Some families found immediate support from relatives or community networks, while others spent weeks or months in temporary settlements. Throughout these developments, the movement of people across Punjab continued at a remarkable pace. Historians later estimated that more than 10 million individuals crossed the new border during the months following partition. This made the migration one of the largest population transfers recorded in modern history. The human consequences of such a large movement were complex. Families were separated during hurried departures, property was left behind, and entire neighbourhoods changed character as new residents arrived. Yet even amid these difficulties, migrants also displayed resilience and cooperation. Travellers often shared food and water with strangers encountered along the road. Community organisations formed relief committees to distribute supplies. Volunteers worked in refugee camps to help register arrivals and locate missing family members. Governments on both sides of the border also began coordinating efforts to manage the crisis. Joint military patrols were organised in certain areas of Punjab to stabilise conditions along migration routes. Officials from India and Pakistan held meetings to discuss ways of reducing violence and assisting refugees. Gradually, these measures began improving the situation. By the late autumn of 1947, the largest waves of migration had started to slow as more families reached their destinations, refugees and lost homelands. By the late months of 1947, the largest waves of migration were beginning to settle into a new stage. The journeys across roads and railway lines had carried millions of people away from towns and villages where their families had lived for generations. Now many of those travellers were arriving in unfamiliar cities and rural districts where they would attempt to rebuild their lives. In both India and Pakistan, the sudden arrival of refugees created an enormous humanitarian challenge. Government administrations were still in their earliest stages of development, and yet they were now responsible for assisting millions of new citizens who required housing, food, employment, and medical care. Temporary refugee camps appeared across northern India and Pakistan during these months. Schools, military barracks, warehouses, and public parks were converted into shelters where families could rest after their long journeys. Rows of tents were erected in open fields to accommodate the large number of arrivals. In Delhi, the capital of India, the population increased dramatically within a short time. Large numbers of Hindu and Sikh refugees from western Punjab and other regions of Pakistan arrived in the city seeking safety and opportunity. Some came by train, while others arrived by road after long journeys through the countryside. Government buildings, historical monuments, and open grounds around the city became temporary homes for refugees. Relief workers distributed food rations, blankets, and medical supplies to families who had arrived with very few possessions. Similar scenes unfolded in cities within Pakistan. Lahore, which had lost many of its Hindu and Sikh residents during the migration, now received Muslim refugees arriving from eastern Punjab, Delhi, and other areas of northern India. Public buildings and vacant houses were used to accommodate the newcomers, while longer-term arrangements were being organised. The experience of arriving in these new places was often both hopeful and uncertain. Refugees were grateful to have reached what they believed would be a safer environment, yet they also faced the challenge of beginning life again in unfamiliar surroundings. Many families had left behind homes, businesses, and farmland that had been part of their history for generations. In the absence of those resources, they now depended on government assistance and community networks to find stability. Authorities in both countries began establishing departments dedicated to refugee rehabilitation. These agencies were responsible for registering displaced families, organising housing allocations, and helping individuals locate employment. In India, one of the major programs involved distributing abandoned property that had been left behind by Muslim families who had migrated to Pakistan. Houses, shops, and farmland in cities such as Delhi, Amritsar, and other parts of northern India were reassigned to Hindu and Sikh refugees who had lost their own property during migration. Pakistan implemented similar policies. Properties vacated by departing Hindu and Sikh residents were allocated to Muslim refugees arriving from India. These arrangements were intended to provide displaced families with immediate access to homes and livelihoods. However, the process was complex and often slow. Many records had been lost or damaged during the chaotic months of migration. Determining ownership and assigning property fairly required careful investigation by administrative officials. Meanwhile, everyday life inside refugee camps followed a routine shaped by necessity. Families waited in lines to receive food distributions, medical care, and clothing supplies. Volunteers from charitable organisations worked alongside government officials to manage the camps and maintain sanitation. Children adapted quickly to these new environments. Makeshift schools were sometimes established within camps so that education could continue. Teachers among the refugees organised lessons using whatever materials were available. Adults spent much of their time searching for relatives who had become separated during the migration. Notice boards and registration offices allowed individuals to leave messages in the hope that missing family members might eventually find them. Over time, many reunions did occur. Letters and word of mouth helped locate relatives who had travelled by different routes or arrived in different cities. Each reunion provided a moment of relief within a period otherwise marked by uncertainty. The social fabric of cities began changing as refugee communities settled into new neighbourhoods. In Delhi, entire districts gradually became home to families who had once lived in Lahore, Rawalpindi, or other cities that were now part of Pakistan. Their dialects, food traditions, and cultural customs added new layers to the life of the capital. Lahore experienced similar transformations. Muslim refugees arriving from India brought with them traditions from cities such as Delhi, Aligarh, and Lucknow. Markets, schools, and cultural institutions slowly reflected the influence of these new residents. Economic life also began adjusting to the presence of displaced populations. Refugees often used skills they had practiced in their previous homes to start businesses in their new locations. Shopkeepers reopened small stores, artisans resumed their crafts, and farmers began cultivating land that had been reassigned to them. These efforts gradually restored a sense of stability in communities that had experienced rapid change. While the loss of former homes remained a powerful memory, new networks of cooperation developed among refugee families who shared similar experiences. Governments continued expanding programs designed to support rehabilitation. Loans were offered to help refugees start businesses, and housing developments were constructed in some cities to provide permanent residences. The process of rebuilding was neither quick nor simple. For many families, it required years of adaptation and perseverance. Yet the determination to create new homes became a defining feature of this period. By the end of the 1940s, millions of refugees had begun establishing themselves within their adopted communities. Neighbourhoods that had once been temporary camps gradually transformed into permanent districts filled with schools, markets, and houses. Governments struggled to respond. By the end of 1947, both India and Pakistan were facing challenges that few newly formed states had ever encountered at the moment of their birth. Each country had inherited parts of the administrative structure that had once belonged to the British Raj. Yet those systems were still being reorganised to function under new national governments. At the same time, millions of refugees required immediate assistance. The leaders of both countries quickly realised that managing the consequences of partition would require coordinated efforts across many branches of government. Ministries responsible for housing, food supply, transportation, and public health all became involved in addressing the needs of displaced populations. In India, the central government established the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation to organise assistance for refugees arriving from Pakistan. Officials working in this department collected records about displaced families, arranged temporary accommodations, and supervised the distribution of food and clothing. Delhi soon became one of the main centres of these activities. The city had received hundreds of thousands of refugees within only a few months. Large camps were set up in areas such as Purana Kila and Kingsway Camp, where tents and simple shelters housed families who had recently arrived from Punjab and other regions. Administrators in these camps worked to register each family and document where they had come from. These records helped authorities determine what kind of assistance might be needed and whether relatives could be located in other cities. Providing food was one of the most immediate concerns. Government supply agencies organised deliveries of grain, lentils, cooking oil, and other essentials to refugee camps and urban neighbourhoods where displaced families had settled. Community kitchens often prepared meals that were distributed throughout the day. Medical care was also a priority. Doctors and nurses visited camps to treat illnesses that had developed during long journeys. Vaccination programs were organised to prevent outbreaks of disease in crowded conditions where sanitation systems were still developing. Pakistan faced similar challenges, particularly in cities such as Lahore and Karachi, where large numbers of Muslim refugees had arrived from India. The Pakistani government established departments responsible for refugee welfare and began coordinating relief efforts with local authorities and charitable organisations. In Karachi, which had become Pakistan's capital, officials worked to provide housing for migrants arriving from cities such as Delhi, Lucknow, and Aligarh. Temporary accommodations were arranged in public buildings, while new residential areas were planned for longer-term settlement. The division of administrative resources between the two new countries added further complexity to these efforts. When British India had been partitioned, government departments, financial reserves, and military units also had to be divided. Each nation inherited only a portion of the former colonial administration. This meant that many institutions were being constructed almost from the beginning. Civil servants were recruited and trained to manage departments that had previously operated within a single imperial framework. The armed forces were also reorganised during this period. Units of the former British Indian Army were allocated between India and Pakistan, and officers were assigned to new commands. Ensuring stability during the transition required careful coordination between military leaders in both countries. Despite the scale of these administrative tasks, both governments continued searching for ways to manage the refugee crisis more effectively. One approach involved formal agreements between India and Pakistan, designed to protect minority communities who had chosen not to migrate. Political leaders hoped that reassuring these communities might reduce further population movement and stabilise conditions along the border. Public statements emphasised the importance of maintaining peace and respecting the rights of all citizens regardless of religion. At the same time, authorities attempted to regulate the movement of refugees who were still travelling across the frontier. Border checkpoints were established where officials could record arrivals and direct migrants toward appropriate reception centres. Transportation networks were gradually reorganised to support these efforts. Special trains were sometimes scheduled to carry refugees safely between major cities on either side of the border. Military escorts were occasionally provided along routes where tensions remained high. The economic consequences of migration also required attention. Many refugees had arrived without financial resources, and governments recognised that long-term stability would depend on helping these families become economically independent. Programs were introduced to provide loans and employment opportunities. Skilled workers were encouraged to resume trades they had practiced before migration. In some cases, factories and workshops that had been abandoned during the partition were reopened with the help of refugee labour. Agriculture presented another important opportunity. Large areas of farmland had been left behind by families who migrated to the other country. Governments began redistributing these lands to refugee farmers who had lost their own property. These policies gradually helped displaced families rebuild livelihoods. Farmers planted new crops, Merchants reopened shops, and craftsmen established workshops in neighbourhoods where refugee communities were settling. While the progress was uneven and often slow, these efforts demonstrated the determination of both governments to address the enormous challenges created by partition. International organisations also took notice of the situation. Relief groups and humanitarian agencies offered assistance in providing medical supplies and technical advice for managing refugee settlements. The experiences of these early years shaped the development of both countries' administrative systems. Officials who had worked in refugee rehabilitation departments gained valuable experience in organising large-scale public programs. At the same time, the presence of millions of refugees changed the social composition of many regions. Cities expanded as new neighbourhoods were constructed to house displaced populations, and economic networks adapted to incorporate the skills and labour of these communities. The division of Bengal. While the dramatic migrations of Punjab often drew the most attention during the months after partition, another major transformation was unfolding in the eastern part of the subcontinent. The province of Bengal, like Punjab, had been divided by the Radcliffe line into two separate regions that now belong to different countries. For centuries, Bengal had been one of the most culturally and economically important areas of the Indian subcontinent. Its fertile river delta supported extensive rice cultivation, and its waterways connected villages, towns, and trading centres through a network of rivers and canals. The province was also known for its literary traditions, educational institutions, and vibrant urban life. By the early 20th century, Bengal contained a complex mixture of religious communities. The eastern districts had large Muslim populations, while western areas included significant Hindu communities. The provincial capital of Calcutta served as a major industrial and commercial centre, where people of many backgrounds lived and worked together. When discussions about partition began in the 1940s, Bengal presented a difficult problem similar to that of Punjab. Dividing the province along religious lines meant separating communities that had long shared economic and cultural ties. The final decision created two regions. Western Bengal became part of the new Indian state of West Bengal, with Calcutta as its capital. The eastern districts formed East Pakistan, which was administratively connected to Pakistan despite being separated from it by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Unlike the swift population shifts in Punjab, migration in Bengal developed more gradually. Many residents initially believed that daily life might continue even after the political boundary had been drawn. Economic connections between eastern and western districts had existed for generations, and some people hoped those connections might remain intact. However, over time, increasing numbers of families began relocating. Hindu communities from East Pakistan often moved towards cities and towns in West Bengal, while Muslim families from Indian territory travelled eastward across the border. These migrations unfolded across the waterways and roads that characterised the region. Boats carried families along rivers that had long served as transportation routes. Trains and carts also transported migrants between districts, as people searched for places where they could establish new homes. Calcutta became one of the primary destinations for refugees arriving from East Pakistan. The city had already been a major centre of industry and commerce, but the sudden arrival of large numbers of migrants placed new pressure on housing, employment, and public services. Government authorities and charitable organisations worked to provide assistance to incoming families. Refugee camps were established in and around the city where temporary shelters could accommodate those who had not yet found permanent residences. Over time, many refugees settled in newly developed neighbourhoods on the outskirts of Calcutta. These communities gradually transformed from temporary settlements into permanent districts where migrants rebuilt their lives. East Pakistan experienced similar changes as Muslim families arrived from West Bengal and other parts of India. Towns and rural areas received newcomers who brought with them traditions, languages, and occupations from their previous homes. Agricultural land played an important role in accommodating migrants in the eastern region. Families who had worked as farmers often sought opportunities to cultivate fields in districts where land was available. Local administrators helped coordinate these arrangements, though the process sometimes required adjustments to existing property systems. The division of Bengal also affected trade and transportation networks that had once operated across the entire province. Rail lines and river routes that previously connected eastern and western districts now crossed an international border. Customs checkpoints and new regulations gradually reshaped the flow of goods. Merchants who had conducted business throughout Bengal had to adapt to these new conditions. Some relocated their operations to cities where markets remained accessible, while others developed new trade routes that complied with the political boundaries established after partition. Cultural institutions also adjusted to the new geography. Universities, publishing houses, and artistic communities that had once interacted across the province began focusing on activities within their respective countries. Writers and scholars documented the experiences of migration and the changes occurring within their societies. For many families who moved across the Bengal border, the experience differed from the rapid departures seen in Punjab. The movement often occurred in stages, with relatives travelling at different times depending on economic opportunities and family decisions. Even so, the cumulative number of migrants in the eastern region became very large. Over the following years, millions of people relocated between East Pakistan and India, reshaping the demographic landscape of both areas. The cultural identity of Bengal remained strong despite these political divisions. Language, literature, and artistic traditions continued connecting communities on both sides of the border. Yet the administrative separation introduced new political realities that influenced daily life. The events of partition left lasting impressions on the people of Bengal. Stories about migration, adaptation, and rebuilding communities became part of family histories passed down through generations. Families, memories, and silences. By the time the first and most chaotic waves of migration had begun to slow, the partition of India had already entered a different stage in the lives of those who had survived it. The roads were less crowded than they had been in the late summer and autumn of 1947. The trains no longer carried quite the same endless press of families moving with whatever they could tie into cloth bundles or stack into wooden carts. Refugee camps still existed, and governments in both India and Pakistan were still struggling to house and register the displaced. But the immediate movement of millions had gradually given way to something quieter and, in many ways, harder to measure. People had reached new places. Now they had to live there. This was the stage in which the deepest consequences of partition began to settle into ordinary life. A border had been drawn across the map, but the more lasting division existed inside memory, inside family history, and inside the quiet habits of people who had left one home and built another. The migration had been counted in numbers, millions displaced, cities transformed, provinces divided, but its longer story remained within households. It survived in the names of lost towns, in stories told carefully at night, in recipes carried across borders, in keys to houses that no longer belonged to the people who kept them. For many families, the first years after migration were consumed by practical concerns. They needed food, work, shelter, and schools for their children. A father who had owned a shop in Lahore might now be trying to sell cloth in Delhi from a rented stall. A farmer from western Punjab might find himself in Indian territory, working unfamiliar land and learning new arrangements of water rights, taxes, and ownership. A family that had lived in a prosperous neighbourhood in Amritsar or Rawalpindi might now share one room in a crowded quarter of Karachi or Calcutta. Daily necessity left little time for reflection, and yet memory remained present even when it was not spoken aloud. The people who had crossed the borders in 1947 and the years just after it often carried a precise knowledge of what had been left behind. They remembered the shape of courtyards, the route from home to market, the sound of evening prayers in streets where several religious communities had once lived within walking distance of one another. They remembered harvest seasons, school buildings, local festivals, trees planted by grandparents, wells used by several households, and the names of neighbours who had once been part of the ordinary structure of life. In many cases, those memories were complicated rather than simple. Partition was not only a story of departure and arrival, It was also a story of relationships broken by politics that moved more quickly than the human heart could easily follow. Some families remembered neighbours who had warned them to leave before violence reached their district. Others remembered former friends who had turned distant during those uneasy weeks when the future of each village and town seemed uncertain. There were stories of kindness, stories of fear, and stories in which neither could be separated neatly from the other. That complexity helps explain why partition often entered family history through fragments rather than complete narratives. Children born after 1947 sometimes grew up hearing only parts of what had happened. A grandmother might refer to a city that was now in another country and then fall silent. A father might describe the business his family once owned, but say very little about the journey that ended it. Certain names would be spoken often, while other details were left unmentioned. Silence itself became part of the inheritance. There were several reasons for this. For some survivors, the years immediately after migration demanded such intense concentration on rebuilding that there was simply no space to dwell on what had been lost. The practical labour of survival required attention every day. For others, the memories were tied to grief, fear, and dislocation so deep that speaking of them offered little comfort. And for many, there was no simple audience for the full truth. Children needed stability, not only sorrow. New nations were building public stories of patriotism, independence, and national purpose, while private families were living with older maps still folded in the mind. The experience differed from one region to another. In Punjab, where migration had been sudden and immense, family memory often centred on speed. The hurried decision, the warning from a relative, the rush to the train station, the house locked behind them, the grain left in storage, the account books abandoned in a shop, the livestock sold too cheaply or simply released. In Bengal, the story was often slower and more layered. Some families moved in stages across several years. One relative would go first, another would wait, a household would divide temporarily, and the final decision to leave might come only after it became clear that life would not return to its earlier pattern. These different rhythms shaped memory in different ways. Sudden departure often fixed a place in the mind as it looked on the final day. Gradual departure created a more extended sorrow, in which leaving happened by degrees and certainty was postponed until it could no longer be avoided. The children of partition refugees grew up inside these emotional landscapes even when no one described them directly. They learned that their families belonged somewhere else before they belonged here. They might be born in Delhi, Karachi, Lahore, or Calcutta, yet hear repeatedly of another town, another lane, another river, another district. In this way, partition created not only refugees in the first generation, but also descendants shaped by places they had never seen. That inheritance was cultural as much as emotional. Families carried food traditions across the border and recreated them in new cities. Speech patterns migrated with them. Words from one region entered the streets of another. Merchants rebuilt old kinds of shops in new neighbourhoods. Religious practices and family customs adapted to unfamiliar surroundings without disappearing. Entire urban districts were transformed by the arrival of displaced communities who brought with them skills, tastes, memories, and habits formed elsewhere. Delhi provides one of the clearest examples. The city changed profoundly after partition, as large numbers of Hindu and Sikh refugees from what became Pakistan arrived and settled there. Entire neighbourhoods were reshaped by families from Lahore, Rawalpindi, and other western Punjabi towns. They opened businesses, built schools, formed social associations, and gradually contributed to the making of a new post-colonial capital. The city that emerged in the 1950s was not simply the old Delhi under a new flag. It was a city remade by migration. Lahore experienced a parallel transformation. Once a city of mixed communities, it became predominantly Muslim after partition and received large numbers of migrants from Indian cities and towns. Those newcomers helped define the city's post-1947 identity. They brought educational traditions, literary culture, commercial experience, and urban habits formed in places such as Delhi, Amritsar, Ludhiana and beyond. Lahore, too, became a city not merely changed by partition, but rebuilt through it. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Karachi expanded rapidly with the arrival of Muslim refugees from northern and central India. Calcutta absorbed large refugee populations from East Pakistan. Towns that had once been more regional in character became national centres shaped by displaced people. This process of settlement changed politics as well. Refugee communities were not only passive recipients of aid, they became active political constituencies. They demanded housing, compensation, access to education, and fair treatment in the new states. In India and Pakistan alike, governments had to respond to the voices of people who had lost property and livelihood, but had not lost the will to organise. Partition, therefore, did not end with migration. Its afterlife continued in legislation, urban planning, elections, welfare systems, and debates about citizenship. Still, the most intimate legacy remained within families themselves. Many households preserved objects from before the migration. Some kept land deeds, letters, business papers, or religious books brought from across the border. Others kept jewellery hidden during the journey, family portraits, wedding cloth, utensils, or keys. The key became one of the most powerful private symbols in many partition memories, not because it opened any door in the present, but because it represented the hope, once real and later impossible, that a return might still occur. In some families, older relatives continued for years to speak of going back. They did not always mean permanently. Sometimes they meant only to visit, to see the old house, the old shop, the old fields, or the graves of parents and grandparents. But the political border hardened quickly. Visas, diplomatic tensions, and later wars made such visits difficult or impossible for most people. As the years passed, going back shifted from possibility to longing, and from longing into memory. This is one reason partition remained unfinished in emotional terms long after it was complete on paper. States had been formed, borders had been enforced, populations had largely resettled, yet the imagination of return lingered in countless homes. At the same time, younger generations often related differently to the past. They had their own ambitions in the new countries where they were born or raised. They attended new schools, entered new professions, and formed identities tied to India or Pakistan as existing national realities rather than recent creations. For them, the inherited memory of partition might feel both deeply important and strangely distant. It belonged to their family but not to their direct experience. This generational difference shaped the way partition was remembered in public culture. Memoirs, oral histories, novels, films, and later television programs began drawing out stories that had long remained mostly private. Writers and historians collected recollections from survivors. What had once been spoken only in fragments at home began to enter the larger record of the region's history. These testimonies revealed something important. Partition was not remembered in exactly the same way by everyone. The event was shared, but the meanings attached to it varied. For some, it was remembered mainly as the painful price of independence. For others, it was the necessary beginning of a separate national future. For many, it was both at once, the end of one world and the start of another, neither of which could be understood without the other. In this way, the human legacy of partition can be understood not only through the movement of millions, but through the quieter endurance of memory. A family recipe made in a new city. A photograph carried across the border. A child named after a grandparent buried in another country. A story interrupted before its most difficult part. A silence at the dinner table when an old place name is spoken. These are not small details. They are part of the history, because the partition of India was not only a political event, it was a rearrangement of belonging. And once belonging is rearranged, it does not return easily to its previous form. It becomes layered. People learn to love one home while remembering another. They build new loyalties without erasing older attachments. They become citizens of one country while remaining, in memory, children of a different map. By the middle of the 20th century, India and Pakistan were moving ahead as separate states. Their governments were building institutions. Their citizens were adapting to new borders. Yet within millions of families, the older world remained present, not as a living political reality, but as a remembered one, carried forward in speech, custom, silence, and grief. That is why partition cannot be understood only through diplomacy, boundary commissions, or migration statistics. Its deepest legacy lies in the homes people rebuilt and the homes they continued to remember. A new political map of South Asia. By the early years after 1947, the immediate emergency of migration had begun to settle into a more stable pattern of life. Refugee camps slowly transformed into permanent neighbourhoods. Governments developed stronger administrative systems, and millions of people who had crossed the new border began establishing routines in their adopted homes. Yet even as daily life stabilised, the political landscape of South Asia had been permanently reshaped. Before partition, the Indian subcontinent had existed under a single colonial administration that stretched across a vast territory. After August 1947, that unified structure had been replaced by two sovereign nations, India and Pakistan. The new map introduced international borders where none had existed before, and those borders carried political, military, and economic consequences that would shape the region for decades. India emerged as a large, diverse republic that included hundreds of languages, cultures, and religious traditions within a single political framework. Its leadership, particularly figures such as Jawaharlal Nehru and other members of the Constituent Assembly, focused on building democratic institutions capable of governing a population that numbered in the hundreds of millions. One of the most important steps in this process was the drafting of a new constitution. Beginning shortly after independence, Indian lawmakers worked to design a system that would define the structure of government, outline the rights of citizens, and establish procedures for elections and lawmaking. The constitution was completed in 1950 and formally declared India a sovereign democratic republic. It established a parliamentary system of governance with a president as head of state and a prime minister leading the government. Fundamental rights were included to protect freedoms such as speech, religion, and equality before the law. For a country that had recently emerged from colonial rule and experienced one of the largest migrations in modern history, creating such a political framework represented a major achievement. Elections were organised across vast regions where infrastructure and communication systems were still developing. Pakistan faced a different set of circumstances as it began constructing its own state institutions. The new country had been created from two geographically separate regions, West Pakistan, located along the northwestern part of the subcontinent, and East Pakistan in the eastern delta region, formerly part of Bengal. These two regions were separated by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, making governance particularly complex. Communication between them required long travel routes by air or sea, and economic conditions in the two areas differed significantly. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who had become Pakistan's first Governor-General, focused on establishing administrative order and defining the principles that would guide the new country. He emphasized the importance of law, discipline, and equality among citizens. However, the early years of Pakistan's existence were marked by several challenges. Jinnah died in September 1948, only a little more than a year after the country's creation. His passing left the young state without the leadership figure who had been most closely associated with its founding vision. Pakistan continued building its political institutions under new leaders, but the process proved difficult. Debates about the structure of government, the relationship between central and provincial authority, and the role of religion in public life became important topics within the country's political discussions. At the same time, relations between India and Pakistan were influenced by disputes that had emerged soon after partition. One of the most significant concerned the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Unlike provinces directly governed by the British Raj, princely states had been ruled by local monarchs who maintained internal authority while recognising British oversight. At the time of independence, these states were given the option of joining either India or Pakistan. The ruler of Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh, initially attempted to remain independent. However, political unrest and military developments in the region soon led to conflict between forces associated with both new nations. The resulting war in 1947-1948 ended with a ceasefire line dividing the region into areas administered by India and Pakistan. The dispute over Kashmir would remain one of the most sensitive issues in relations between the two countries. Despite these political tensions, both nations continued focusing on internal development during the early years of independence. Economic planning, educational expansion, and industrial growth became priorities for leaders seeking to strengthen their countries. In India, large infrastructure projects were initiated to support agriculture and energy production. Dams, irrigation systems, and research institutions were built as part of broader development strategies designed to improve living standards across rural and urban areas. Pakistan also invested in agricultural and industrial development, particularly in regions where refugee communities had settled and were rebuilding livelihoods. New towns and housing areas were constructed to accommodate the population changes created by migration. The transformation of cities continued throughout the 1950s and beyond. Delhi, Karachi, Lahore, and Calcutta all expanded significantly as refugees integrated into urban economies and established businesses, schools, and cultural institutions. The cultural landscape of South Asia evolved alongside these political and economic developments. Writers, filmmakers, and historians began reflecting on the events of partition in literature and public discussion. Their works explored the human experiences behind the historical transformation. Some authors focused on the journeys of migrants who crossed the border during those chaotic months. Others examined how communities adjusted to new identities within newly defined nations. These narratives helped preserve memories that might otherwise have faded as time passed. Educational institutions also began studying partition as a subject of historical research. Scholars examined archival documents, government records, and personal testimonies in order to understand how such a vast political change had occurred. Through these studies, the Partition of India gradually came to be recognized not only as a national event, but also as a major episode in global history. Few other moments had produced such a large and rapid movement of people across newly established borders. Yet, even as historians analysed the political decisions behind partition, the everyday consequences continued shaping life for millions of individuals. Cities that had once been culturally mixed had developed new identities. Neighbourhoods that had formed from refugee settlements became permanent parts of urban geography. Families whose grandparents had lived in one country now belonged to another. The political map of South Asia had been redrawn, and with it came new possibilities as well as new challenges. India and Pakistan had begun their national journeys under difficult circumstances. Both had inherited the responsibilities of governance at the same moment that millions of their citizens were rebuilding lives after migration. Despite these difficulties, each country gradually developed its own institutions, traditions, and public life. Their histories would continue to evolve in ways influenced by the events of 1947, but not limited to them. The legacy of the Great Migration. By the time the first decade after partition came to an end, the immediate movement of refugees had largely concluded. The roads that once carried endless lines of carts and walkers had returned to their ordinary rhythms. Railway platforms no longer overflowed with families waiting to cross a new border. Camps that once sheltered displaced communities gradually transformed into permanent neighbourhoods with schools, shops and homes built from brick and stone rather than canvas. Yet the legacy of the migration did not fade with the passing of those early years. The Partition of India had reshaped the social, cultural and political landscape of South Asia in ways that would remain visible for generations. Historians later estimated that roughly 14 to 15 million people had crossed the newly created borders between India and Pakistan in the months and years surrounding independence. This made the event one of the largest migrations ever recorded in modern history. It unfolded not over centuries, but within a remarkably short period of time. Entire regions were transformed by this movement. Cities that had once been culturally mixed became more religiously homogeneous. Lahore, which had long been home to Muslim, Hindu and Sikh communities, became predominantly Muslim after the migration. Delhi, which had contained large Muslim populations before partition, saw the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Hindu and Sikh refugees who reshaped the city's neighbourhoods and economy. The cultural identities of these cities evolved along with their populations. Markets began selling foods associated with the regions from which refugees had come. Languages spoken in the streets changed as migrants brought dialects and expressions from their former homes. New schools, religious institutions and cultural associations reflected the traditions carried by displaced families. Economic life also adapted to these shifts. Refugee communities often relied on skills they had practiced before migration. Merchants reopened small businesses, artisans returned to their crafts, and farmers cultivated newly assigned land. Over time, these activities helped rebuild local economies and integrate migrants into the societies of their new countries. Governments in both India and Pakistan continued implementing programs to support this process. Housing developments were constructed for refugee families who had spent months or years in temporary settlements. Financial assistance and loans helped migrants establish businesses or purchase farmland. Despite these efforts, the emotional consequences of partition remained present within families long after the physical journeys had ended. The migration had separated relatives, divided communities, and left many people with memories of homes that no longer belonged to them. For older generations, the places left behind often remained vivid in memory. Conversations within households frequently included stories about towns across the border, streets where families once lived, markets where businesses had operated, or schools where parents and grandparents had studied. And now, as we reach the quiet end of tonight's journey, it helps to remember that history is not only a record of events, it is also a collection of human experiences, moments of uncertainty, adaptation and resilience that shape the lives of generations. The night grows still again. The long roads of migration have faded into memory, and the lights of distant cities settle into calm routines. Somewhere, in countless homes across South Asia and around the world, the descendants of those travellers continue living ordinary evenings, shaped by an extraordinary past. Let the story rest here for now,